Well, thank you all very much for joining us this evening, or as I said, this afternoon or this morning. For those of you who have not been or attended one of these presentations before, this is an online joint seminar series that is sponsored by the American Research Institute in Turkey, the Institute of Nautical Archaeology, as well as KUDAR, which is the Maritime Archaeology Research Center at Koç University. And we have the wonderful opportunity to invite a number of scholars to these online events. And it's rather predictable and straightforward. After the presentation this evening from Lana Radloff, there will be a chance for questions and answers afterwards for about 15 or 20 minutes. So this evening, clearly, we're going to be hearing from Dr. Lana Radloff. She received her PhD in Mediterranean archaeology at the University of Buffalo. She is presently preparing a monograph for Brill, and she is actually, if I understand correctly, you've been tearing up the lecture circuit a bit with all of your presentations recently. So she has recently appeared at the Archaeological Institute of America annual meeting just a few weeks ago. And prior to that, she was also giving a similar presentation at a conference on port cities in Aix-Marseille. Was that just a few months ago, or when was that?
About a year ago.
About a year ago. Okay. Well, Lana Radloff has been teaching at Bishop's University in Quebec, Canada between 2018 and 2023. And presently, she is in residence as a senior associate member at the American School of Classical Studies in Athens, which is actually where she's joining us this evening. So having said that, everyone please mute your microphones. And I suppose, Lana, the rest is up to you. So thank you again for coming.
Well, before I begin with my talk, I just want to thank Erit, Aina, and Kudar, as well as Matthew, Tuba, and Zainab for inviting me to give this talk, especially as an early career researcher. This is a great opportunity for me to share my research online, which reaches a wider audience, and to get feedback on it, particularly at an early stage. But I also wanted to thank everyone else who's coming to attend today. I know you have very busy lives, and so I appreciate you coming and taking the time to hear what I have to say. So I'm just going to start by sharing my screen. Okay. Everybody can see that fine, I take it? I'm going to assume that's a thumbs up. Okay, before I get started on the text and move into my slides, I just wanted to put out a big content warning here due to the nature of my talk, as well as the way that I integrate contemporary narratives and research on migrant women. Today, there can be topics here that are quite difficult, and some testimonies that recall, can push people back towards thinking about those in their own personal experiences. Okay, so when we consider the sea, what usually comes to mind are ships, trade, harbors, and transport vessels. What does not come to mind normally is women. As a result, the maritime landscape is a mirage. It is devoid of their presence, activities, experiences, and contributions, essentially rendering them invisible. Nevertheless, women were important contributors to the domestic economy and key agents of religion, nested within overlapping and multi-scalar Mediterranean-wide networks. They were also, as commodities themselves, part and parcel of forced mobility through armed conflict and marriage and motherhood. In past and present, Greece and Turkey are a nexus for forced mobility networks, and mobility networks in general as well, given their position within the Eastern Mediterranean. And today, women account for over 52% of displaced individuals, leading to a feminization of migration. However, their stories are often left untold, and the connection between feminism and migration underexplored. So this quote from Ursula Le Guin, we are volcanoes. When we women offer our experiences as truth, as human truth, all the maps change. There are new mountains. I like this quote because it links together these aspects of both women, their voices, as well as the topography, geography, and landscapes, and the way that women specifically engage with those, whether that's to embed their experiences or perhaps to reflect those. So my overarching research project is the Feminetworks project, of which I'm going to talk to you about a portion today. And the goal is to address this lacuna, right, these missing voices in the sea and maritime landscapes by piecing together fragments of her stories. So my aims are twofold. First of all, to reconstruct the embodied lived experience of female maritime mobility networks in the ancient Greek world, as well as the Eastern Mediterranean in general. And this ties into my second aim, which is to use ancient Miletus, specifically my case study here, as a medium for investigating the unique barriers and conditions that women currently encounter as migrants. So according to Bartolini et al. 2016, since 2015, over 1 million refugees have fled to Greece. And of course, many of these are coming through Turkey. This mirrors the refugee crisis of 1919 to 1922 of the Greco-Turkish War. Then, as now, refugees arrived at the port of Piraeus, dubbed the Port of Agony, which is emblematic of the refugees' marginalization and impoverishment. And there's currently an exhibition at the American School of Classical Studies that discusses American relief in Greece specifically during this time period. And of course, since then, we have the breakout of the Ukraine war, which obviously talks about two kinds of Ukrainian war, depending on your demographics. Migrants from Africa, Italy, India, and the Middle East have a different experience than others. In addition, the UN reiterates in 2022, you can see that women pay the highest price in conflict. And of course, this includes Ukraine. And now, of course, the Gaza war. And so this article by the UN Women, specifically Arab states, discusses women and girls during the war in Gaza, including facts and figures, which you can read on your screen. But it's not just these external conflicts, there's internal conflicts. And this brings me to my own home country in Canada, in which there's an epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women who are 12 times more likely to be murdered or missing than any other women in Canada. And so you can see this quote, "We are alone and often far away from home." And I think there's these echoes between past and present that we can see here as well. So as you can observe, my critical classical reception studies form the core of my academic work. So what this means is I strive to be a scholar activist who openly exposes, challenges, and critiques the Eurocentrism and use of Greco-Roman antiquity that is interwoven visibly and invisibly into the fabric of the present to validate systemic practices of oppression and inequality. I engage with critical reception in my scholarship to push the boundary of classics, ancient studies, Mediterranean archaeology, and allied fields within the context of the modern world and to transform the disciplines into a positive political instrument so that all voices are heard, past and present. Nevertheless, I need to be clear that these are not my stories, but those of other women. I am not a migrant. I am of Western European descent and from Canada. So I cannot possibly understand the things that these women go through and the feelings that they have. Yet my hope is that I can honor their voices and experiences. So here I follow the method of Indigenous storytelling to incorporate the experiences through their experiences through accounts of women in antiquity and today. And so you'll see these accounts of women, both from past literature as well as archaeological evidence and today, embedded or interwoven periodically throughout my presentation. So the preponderance of primary sources written by elite ethnocentric men and the almost complete absence of female authors results in a skewed representation of lives of ancient women as isolated within the household and passive within socio-political and economic processes of the private and public world. So here, drawing again on indigenous epistemologies and methodologies, to counter the male biases within the primary sources and the scholarly tradition, I utilize the practice of two-eyed seeing. This is the indigenous method of combining traditional indigenous knowledge with that in mainstream Western science. So you're seeing with one eye with the indigenous knowledge and one eye with Western science. I use this because it emphasizes, quote, land and other than human relationships, the embodiment of subject to place, spatial understandings, and power relations in knowledge and representation, and the processes by which they are produced, expressed, and diversified. So indigenous epistemologies create a pathway out of the double helix of male biases within primary sources in the scholarly tradition by centering women within their communities and environment as active agents of themselves and bringers and protectors of life. Because indigenous communities do not own the land, they take care of it. Women are fundamental to the balance of human and natural realms, including water and waterscapes. So my theoretical framework and methodological approach here employs a multicultural and multidisciplinary framework. I pair digital modeling with current feminist and intersectional research, historical accounts of women, and indigenous gynocentric epistemologies. Such an approach makes space for exploring the role of women in ancient maritime networks and leads to novel observations about their contributions to the complex interactions that took place on the sea. So now that I've kind of set out my general framework of methods and theory, and I'll elaborate on this as I go, I'll move quickly to my data set on Miletus and then give you a sum up of what's to come. So Miletus is a valuable model for reconstructing female maritime mobility networks because of his extensive scholarship, on its natural and built environments, its robust prosopographic record, and its multicultural maritime character. From the Bronze Age onward, it was a thriving commercial center in the Southeast Aegean on the main sea routes to the Black Sea and Eastern and Western Mediterranean. It was also in proximity to the Meander River and the overland and riverine transportation routes to inland Anatolia. And so this is the Meander River here, and here is Miletus right here. And this is showing the progradation of the Meander Valley, which eventually subsumes Miletus so that it's all on land today. So for the rest of my talk, I'm going to focus on a particular case study of mass migrations from Crete to Miletus in the mid-3rd century BCE. I'll start with an overview of the citizenship decrees, then examine the terminology to determine the demographics of the passengers, estimate the passengers' supplies based on distinctions in their identities, and really the bulk of my presentation will focus on this reconstruction of the sea route from Crete to Miletus. So moving to the overview of the citizenship decrees. Fragments of two Cretan citizenship decrees dating to 234-3 BCE and 229-8 BCE were found at Miletus during the German campaigns of the early 20th century. They were originally located on the outer walls of the Delphinion, the sanctuary of the civic god Apollo Delphinios, and the ceremonial and administrative center of the city of Miletus. The decrees date to a period of unrest in Crete and Miletus and thus offer a potential explanation for the mass enrollment of Cretans within the Milesian state. In the mid-3rd century BCE, prior to the breakout of the social war, the coalition of Knossos and Gortyn kept the states under constant pressure. Shortly after the mass migrations, the Lydian War broke out when Litos attacked and sacked by an alliance of Cretan states led by Knossos, which broke down when several allies defected to the Lydians once again. Civil unrest may have incentivized the movement of the Cretans to leave their homeland. Albert Rem in 1914 speculates that they were already around Miletus serving as mercenaries and did not want to return home. Thus, they may not have come directly from Crete, but rather were living in the area and then were recruited from there. Around this same time, Miletus itself was also involved in conflict with the Hellenistic kings and either took advantage of the proximity of the Cretans in the area or enlisted them directly from Crete against the threat of Antigonus Doson and his Carian campaign, and or Attalus I, Antiochus Hyrax, and the Gauls. In either case, for the purpose of this talk and my research, the text attests that the Cretans swore to defend Miletus and its forts on the islands of Leros, Patmos, and Lepsia in exchange for land in the High Bandus. You can see these circled on the red in the screen in red. In exchange, they received the full privileges of citizenship. So in terms of contemporary research and integrating women's voices, this study by Joloffe et al. In 2022 notes that when experiencing armed conflicts and forced migration, women face significant challenges related to changed living conditions, are exposed to health-related consequences. And because of this, women in particular are targets of severe structural and personal violence, even lacking access to the most basic healthcare services. Nevertheless, in spite of that, these women display extraordinary resilience and endurance. They find strength through social support and internal resources. So synthesized qualitative research such as this illustrates that women value social support, including peer support. This accords well with another research study by Taylor et al. In 2000, which challenges this notion of fight or flight, which was established by Cannon in 1932 in The Wisdom of the Body. So traditionally, the human stress response has been characterized physiologically and behaviorally as fight or flight. And this notion has dominated stress research for the last 70 years or so, and has been disproportionately based on studies of men and males. But research also emphasizes that the study of migrants' women's experience is from the Mediterranean, research on migrant women's experiences from the Mediterranean region also note that refugee camps with Tuareg refugees in Burkina Faso have compared psychological distress in male and female people. So there's this research on refugees in Burkina Faso that looks at psychological distress in male and female individuals. And in fact, what it shows is that there's higher rates present in women, particularly those over 40 years old. So they're more at risk for PTSD, and this could potentially be due to their self-awareness. So although the fight or flight may characterize the primary psychological responses to stress for both male and females, and this other research demonstrates that women can actually be more predisposed to the harmful effect of PTSD, there has been a lack of research. So Taylor et al. Here proposed that behaviorally, females, instead of fight or flight, are more marked by a pattern of tend and befriend. So tending involves nurture and activities designed to protect the self and offspring that promotes safety and reduce stress, while befriending is the creation and maintenance of social networks that may aid in this process. The authors then propose, Taylor et al., that women's stress responses are characterized by the following patterns: caring for offspring under stressful circumstances, joining social groups to reduce vulnerability, and contributing to the development of social groupings, especially those involving female networks, for the exchange of resources and responsibility. So this resilience of women that we see today, but is also indicative in ancient sources, which I'll get to throughout my presentation, thus we might view the inclusion of women in these two migrations also as sources of social cohesion and resilience for themselves, their offspring, and their other families, including men, as they embark on their trip to their new home. And so it is also no surprising at all then that in the nomenclature and demographics in the decrees, there are many women, children, and extended family members. So the preserved texts are estimated to list a total of 3,000 to 4,000 people. Of these, there are 102 complete or partial names and titles that can be identified as female. For the Due to the time constraints, I am just going to focus on the later decree of 229-8 BCE, which is noted with the large silver star here. It's longer and gives a fuller account of the details of the alliance between Miletus and the Cretan states involved. And you can see there are 14 of them. Then follows a list of approximately 210 names or fragments of male names and 61 female names. So these are just the individuals in this particular citizenship decree of 229 BCE. The decrees enroll citizens according to their family units and categorize them by nomenclature that designates their age, status, and gender. You can see the age categories and terminology on the screen here. The male heads of households, married and unmarried, are referred to as soldiers, mercenaries, or paid auxiliary. Women, instead, are classed as either married women with and without children, or unmarried girls, a girl of marriageable age but still unmarried, and young girls still in childhood. So these two age categories for girls who are not married. Boys are grouped similarly, boys still in childhood, and two terms for those of marriageable age but still unmarried. So similar to the girls, these age categories for those who are unmarried and still in childhood. These terms not only reflect differences in marital status and marriageability, but also reflect differences in the physical needs for reconstructing the Cretan voyage to Miletus. And I just want to put a quick aside here that this kinship network is something that I'm currently working on and have had the privilege to work with the Past Social Networks project at Aarhus University. These people are experts at networking, and so I'm really excited to see what we might be able to produce together working on this data in terms of uncertainty quantification, also developing an open access repository for data. And I know there's a couple of members here today, so I just wanted to say hi to them as well and thank them for their collaboration with me. So let's just take now another subset of this, right? So there's this second voyage, but I'm actually just going to look at one subset of this, and there's a particular reason why. So I'm going to focus on a particular subset of individuals that took part in the voyage of 229 BCE, which was not inscribed all at the same time. Because of this, it is arranged according to different months and days of the Milesian year. So I'm going to pull out one particular voyage in here. So Rem posits that the initial family register was produced in Tarion, the first month of the Milesian calendar, and then supplemented 3 times and completed with a final supplement in Artemision, the last month of the year. And so these individuals are listed with ethnics, and you can see in the red square, this is one of those months there, Metagaitnion, which is August, September in our calendar. So the demographic data in the citizenship decrees and the organization of the transport according to months permit a reconstruction of the spatial requirements, resources, and weight of a particular group of passengers. Although fragmentary, the best section for such an exercise is the large cohort that made the initial voyage from Crete to Miletus in the month of Tarion in 229 BCE. In this voyage, there were 32 women and elder girls and 21 dependent children, a total of 53 women and children, and 69 men and elder sons, or 122 individuals of the total number of 210 people listed in that citizen decree. So they are diverse in age and gender and marital and parental status, and large enough to illustrate the discursive travel needs of sea travel. By using the terms of familial groups and the decrees to classify the individuals according to age, gender, and parental status, the spatial and dietary needs for the passengers can be reconstructed more accurately and allow for a more detailed insight into the complexity of sea travel and maritime life for women and children, as well as men. The resulting figures that I'll show you in a moment are placed within the context of shipwreck data from the Hellenistic period to consider the number and type of vessels needed to transport the passengers. So just due to time constraints, again, I'm just going to go through this quickly. So observations placed within the context of ancient literary accounts of sea voyages and legal guidelines, in combination with contemporary research, suggest that the 122 passengers, their personal objects, and water and food needs have a combined weight of 8.5 to 13.8 tons, and roughly needing an area of about 50 meters square, but the area is only based on the passengers and their belongings. So the food and water rations would have to need to occupy additional space. This variation, right, in terms of the 8.5 to 13.8 tons, right, it's a lot of variation, right? But this is due to the possibility of pregnancy and breastfeeding and the inexactitude of the children's age. While we know that they're children of certain age, it's difficult to tell, you know, besides that they're still in childhood, exactly what age they're at. So I have this broad window. So my estimates of water and food consumption for a single 3 or 4 days sail, so this is without stopping for supplies, are shown on screen here. All right, so I'm going to move to the last part of my talk, the bulk of it, and this is the reconstruction of the sea route from Crete to Miletus. Pardon me. I should note, though, that I am currently working on the land portion of this travel and finalizing many of these details. So please be aware that there's still work to be done here. In terms of the land portion, while I'm working on the land route and basically the cost of doing that, if you will, I'm going to use Cape Simonion, which I'll point out again in a moment, as an arbitrary starting point for the voyage. So existing studies and geospatial tools such as Stanford's Orbis project and Pascal Arnaud's work on ancient seafaring build networks from the top down. They construct models of mobility primarily through the lens of trade and commerce, emphasizing the spatial and temporal aspects of routes, journeys, distances, and costs, and the quotidian practices at the intersection between geographical areas. My research complements these methods by exploring cult structures as indices of maritime mobility and highlighting the visual discourse between seafarers and the sacred via viewsheds and lines of sight in ArcGIS. Following Justin Leidwanger, I build networks from the bottom up, examining local and regional dynamics I tested in the maritime archaeological record. I argue that sea routes, harbors, and anchorages chosen by migrant vessels were governed by a drive to protect their cargoes, the oikoi, or the household, from the dangers of the sea through interactions with the gods. Thus, they preferred sea lanes and secondary or tertiary hubs of activity with access to food, water, and maritime cults rather than major economic centers. My work utilizes viewshed analysis to evaluate the role of intervisibility in guiding movement and interaction within maritime landscapes, and the role of perception and experience in informing conceptual maritime spaces. It integrates the social and the sacred, the articulation of family, deity, and sea that overlap, intersect, and underpin trade networks and ensure the successful transfer of the household. So I refer to this method or methodological or theoretical approach towards seafaring and reconstructing seafaring networks as sacred seafaring. And this notion also centers with women within my work by emphasizing their roles in cult and religion. And this is because women played a key role in the domestic and religious spheres, both in the domestic and public realm of the polis or the city-state. Women's collective roles in cult and ritual and the maintenance of familial bonds through ancestral worship not only provided gateways to movement beyond the household as they processed to cemeteries, temples, and sanctuaries in an extra-urban context. It also gave them public capital in spite of their marginalization from political decision-making processes. This is also noted in contemporary research as a strategy for resilience. So you can see here, Joloff et al. 2022, women restarted their lives and engaged in political resistance, which was empowering. So on the upper right-hand side, this is a quote by the researchers. At the same time, despite the ongoing and extreme living conditions, women described continued attempts to normalize their daily routines. They described themselves as competent in mastering how to cope with ongoing occupation and political oppression. And part of this was informed by a strategy based on religion. So at the bottom left-hand side, you can see this is a direct quote from a participant. So the growth of faith in our hearts and our religion, we had a strong faith. We understood that our destiny is in the hands of a single creator and nobody can do anything but him. So, and this kind of resilience and way of integrating themselves into society is paired with peer mentoring and nurturing, such as the Melissa Network, which is a not-for-profit organization in Greece that specifically works with migrant and refugee women, promoting empowerment, communication, and active citizenship. So my reconstruction of the potential sea route that the Cretan migrants took to Miletus is as follows, right? And so I'm using this framework of women, their connection with religion, sacred seafaring, in order to reconstruct this route. So the first is a leg from Cape Simonium to Carpathos. And so you can see it's bolded right here. And this is the arbitrary starting point that I mentioned while I'm working on getting the land portion together. The second is from Carpathos to Halasarna on Kos. And the third is a final leg from Halasarna into Miletus or Milesian territory. The view sheds in the images are all my own work and are based on the maximum visibility in summer, which according to our node rarely exceeds 20 nautical miles or roughly 37 to 40 kilometers. I also follow our node's calculation for 1 day's navigation at 12 to 17 hours and roughly 90 to 130 kilometers journey per day. I also assume that there is no night sailing because it's more complex and dangerous. Okay, so let's start by looking at the first leg from Crete to Carpathos. So this is Cape Simonium, right, this arbitrary point, but assuming, right, this departure and wherever they were, right, they're leaving Crete behind. So what I wanted to do is start with a passage from Aeschylus's Suppliants. And so just a little bit of context for folks who aren't familiar with this. Because they were being forced to marry the sons of Egyptus, so this forced marriage, the daughters of Danaus, flee across the Mediterranean Sea to the cities of Argos in mainland Greece. So on the screen, this is the poet Aeschylus, who is a man, of course. In the voice of the chorus is made up of the daughters of Danaus. They say the following shortly after their departure from their home. So such piteous strains of woe I utter in my pain, now shrill, now deep, blended with falling tears. Alas, alas, groans appropriate to funeral wails. Though I live, I chant my own dirge. So you have to see this emotional response here, as well as in the following section, I invoke Appia's hilly land. For well, O land, you understand my foreign speech, right? Emphasizing their foreignness, even though they're foreign too, that they can have discourse with these sacred landscapes and deities. And many times I lay my hands upon Sidonian veil and tear its linen fabric to shreds, right? This reference to a wedding or failed wedding, if you will. And so then we have sacrifices in satisfaction of vows given freely, right? Again, emphasizing these religious aspects. And then I'll just skip to the last one here. Our oars indeed and our timbered ship, bound with yellow rope to withstand the sea, sped me on by help of favoring winds, unharmed by all tempests. Nor have I reason for complaint, but may the all-seeing Father establish a kindly issue in due time. So we've got here, right, this emotional response to their departure from their homeland, the emphasis on the sacred in terms of the interaction between their environment and this journey, as well as the ship being centered or depicted as a mechanism of salvation for them from their woes. And while this isn't the same situation exactly as what we have with these Cretan women potentially leaving their homeland, we can see resonances between the two that are shared, and also in spite of the fact that this is a male author. Also on screen, I'm just pointing out some modern components of this in which the suppliants has been utilized today for trauma theater by the Theater of War Productions. On the right hand is the suppliants project trailer, which is playing. And on the right hand, they did a reading specifically for folks in Ukraine. So moving back to my reconstruction here, the first leg of the Crete Miletus route is from Crete to Carpathos. Carpathos makes a convenient stopping point because it was a midway island where numerous anchorage points facilitate different changes in direction. In this case, the vessel uses it to change from an eastward to northward direction for the second leg of the trip. Along the route, there are two cult sites that are directly tied to seafaring, the Temple of Theike Nymphae on Kassos and the Sanctuary of Poseidon Porthmios on Carpathos. Cult sites on significant promontories had dual purposes. They were used for navigation, signaling dangerous waters such as shallow reefs or rocky coasts or safe anchorages, and they provided opportunities for cult worship. The rock sanctuary of Theike Nymphae is located on the east side of Kassos, approximately 200 meters above the Bay of Chambra. The utility of the site for seafarers is demonstrated by the inscriptions engraved into the living rock on the ledge. The inscriptions date between the 2nd and 1st century BCE, while graffiti at the northern edge of the ridge date back to the classical period. Even today, the place still holds the toponym Tagramata due to the names and letters inscribed on the living rock. Among the inscriptions are theoi, gods, or simply a theta. In open air spaces of worship, proximate to seafarers, theoi is an overall mention of divine power, worshipped in a generic aspect in gratitude and hope for a safe voyage. So an example is on the screen on the bottom there. Here we have one Eudemos Demosthenos inscribes this particular dedication. In the narrow channel between Kassos and Carpathos, where this temple is located, there are still reports of numerous shipwrecks that indicate that it is a dangerous area in modernity. The sanctuary may also be connected with the Samothracian gods. Their cults were usually located at places feared by sailors. Interestingly, there are women attested in the inscriptions as well as men, suggesting that women were among the passengers on ships traveling along the road. Although the sanctuary was difficult to access, the numerous inscriptions testify to the importance of the sanctuary for seafaring and the density of maritime traffic. The bay offered an anchorage point with protection from the northern Etesian winds, where seafarers, both men and women, could revere the gods and restock their water supply before continuing on their journey. On the other side of Carpathos, in the narrow strait with Saros, that small island to the north, there was a sanctuary of Poseidon Porthmios of the ferry. The decrees published at the sanctuary date to the Hellenistic period, but archaeological remains date back to the Archaic period. Two locations have been postulated, one on the southern shore of the harbor at Tristimo. This is the eastern or right on the screen, or the other is at the modern ferry crossing to Saros during the Archaic period. The harbor of Tristimo, the first one, is the western on the left, and the modern ferry crossing is the eastern on the right, depicted on the screen. A viewshed from Cape Simonium demonstrates the visual connectivity between the Cape and the sea road. As the Cape moves out of range, the small island of Kassos comes into view with the Temple of Theike Nymphae in the distance. The north-south orientation and elevation of the rock sanctuary results in a viewshed that extends along the west coast of Carpathos and has a visual connection with Cape Thoanteon and the seascape beyond it to the east. A vessel would then lose sight of the temple briefly before seeing the sanctuary of Poseidon in the distance. Along this route, voyagers could make a stop at Portadown's harbor, the best on the island, where food, water, and other supplies could be found for their journey, and then anchor in the Bay of Tristamo for the night. So this brings me to the second leg of my trip, or my reconstruction. So from Carpathos, the vessel travels to Halasrana on the south coast of Kos via the small island of Nisseros and the other small offshore islands, Pergusa, Pakia, and Strongili. And you can see them labeled on the map. Although not visited by Dawkins and Ways at the turn of the century or myself, I need to confirm the locations of these. They relate that there were so-called Hellenic watchtowers on Pakia and Pergusa, one on the former and two on the latter, and a medieval fort on Strongili. Although the presence of a medieval fort is not proof in and of itself that there was also an ancient defensive structure there in a previous period, the repetitive exploitation of previously occupied sites in the area by the Knights of St. John strongly suggests the possibility. The small islands lie to the west and north of Nisseros. These are Pakia, Pergusa, and Strongili, and provide an effective position from which to extend the island's surveillance of the sea. So here I positioned the towers and fort on the highest elevation of each island for maximum visibility, assuming that all of these would be interconnected for signaling until I can actually confirm the locations of the architecture. So view sheds from the projected position show that they were intervisible with one another in the main settlement at Mandraki Bay. The panoptic views from the towers and fort overlap with the views from Mandraki Bay to surveil the south and east. The view sheds and defensive architecture on the islets suggest that this was a regular transportation corridor from Carpathos further into the Dodecanese. Almost every corner of the 40-kilometer radius around Nisseros was visible and embedded within a network that enabled communication between the towers and settlements on the islands. Then after passing Nisseros, the vessel arrives at Halasrana. And in case you can't see it, Halasrana is right here on the south coast of Kos, where they can visit the Temple of Apollo and anchor in the nearby Bay of Kephalos. Halasrana lies on the south side of the island across from Nisseros and Knidos, Knidos being right here on the opposite peninsula. It is well protected from the Meltemi winds, but also well connected with maritime traffic so as to serve its dual nature of settlement hub and sanctuary site. The materials produced through the excavation of the Temple of Apollo reveal a period of prosperity from the Hellenistic to early Roman period, which coincides with the temple's construction and the reorganization of Kos in 366 BCE. The rough pottery reflects the cosmopolitan nature of the site through a mix of locally produced and imported tablewares likely used for ritual dining. Throughout the Hellenistic period, the settlement became increasingly and more regularly linked to overseas markets as a consumer and producing region. However, the cynicism of 366 BCE, in which all the settlements coalesced into a larger metropolis, did not centralize the island's economy to the degree that all goods went through the capital as an intermediary. Instead, Halasrana evolved alongside coast town, attracting local and foreign ships of various sizes for trade and cult activity. In addition to the Temple of Apollo, other cults with maritime functions attested at Halasrana include Leto, Aphrodite, and the Dioscuri being the protectors of seafarer. Leto and Aphrodite may be part of a joint cult at Halasrana. The cult of Leto was popular in this area of Asia Minor, particularly in Lycia, so southwestern Turkey, and the Rhodian Perea or territories, but it does not occur at Rhodes itself. In addition, fertility and mother goddess figures, such as Leto and Magna Mater, are often found in association with seafaring. So view sheds from Halasrana and Knidos and Nisseros demonstrate the visual connections amongst the island's maritime cults, the Temple of Poseidon, and the Temple of Aphrodite Euploia. So we've got this interaction between the cults here at Halasrana, the Temple of Poseidon, supposedly located here, and the Temple of Aphrodite here. And so you can see the view sheds in terms of what can see what in the table below. In addition to these, twin temples of Aphrodite, Pandemos, and Pontia, so Pontia refers to the sea and often specifically the Black Sea, were also built at coast town to worship Aphrodite in her capacity as protector of the Coan people and people at sea. The importance of the goddess's maritime aspects on coast is suggested by the inscriptions related to merchants, ship owners, and skippers traveling to and from coast town. One is a bilingual dedication in both Greek and Phoenician to Aphrodite, or Astarte in the Phoenician, dating to around 306 BCE, which illustrates the multi-ethnic and geographical extents of the cult. So it relates, erected to Aphrodite, some Timo, son of Abdalonymos, king of Sidon, for the protection of those traveling at sea. So these demonstrate that coast was an attractive emporion for seafarers, foreigners, and locals alike wanted to patronize it and maintain a good relationship with the island because of its location in relation to sea routes. Even the imposition of harbor taxes did not dissuade visitors. So the evolution of Halasarna alongside coast town and the dual role of Aphrodite suggests that there could have also been a second cult site at Halasarna to collect harbor taxes. Nevertheless, because the dual temples of Aphrodite, Pandemos, and Pontia are enclosed within the fortification walls of Coast Town, they are not visible from the sea. So this view shed right here showing how wide this view would be from the sea to the temple of Aphrodite and Coast Town is actually wrong. And it's because as you can see here, here's the temples, right? And here's this kind of the bay, including the peninsula enclosing it and the walls, right? And so it's unlikely that it would have been visible, but I will be adapting also my my maps in order to reflect the architecture and to be more accurate. So in addition to Coast Town, Halasarna, and Knidos, the cult of Aphrodite, right, this Aphrodite who's associated with seafaring, was located just outside Miletus at the sanctuary of Aphrodite in Oikos. And so these are the locations of Aphrodite along this route with the red stars here on screen. So Aphrodite's sanctuary overlooked the sea on a low hill at Zayton Tepe, 2 kilometers southwest of Miletus, just outside the city walls, where the Cretan founder, Miletus, established the original settlement called Oikos, which means houses. So this Cretan founder gave his name to the city and then establishes the original settlement at Oikos, which is why this temple of Aphrodite is there and outside of the later settlement. So the importance of Aphrodite's sanctuary for seafaring is demonstrated by the materials from archaeological excavation, which include Eastern imports. Greaves, who has examined Aphrodite's epithets in Miletus and its colonies, concludes that the goddess's cult provided a common bond between Miletus and her numerous colonies and reinforced its seafaring networks further afield. There's early literary accounts by Posidippus and Theocritus that describe the temple before it was actually discovered with archaeological evidence, which is amazing. And so you can see, I'm not going to go through these in detail, but just in the first one, there's seeming connection to prostitution. Calliston, who never sent a lover away from her door. So Kypris, Kythera, right, referring to Aphrodite, born on the island of Cyprus. And then the second one, you can see this toponym, Oikos, right, referring to Oikos, the sanctuary of Aphrodite. And then finally, we have this association with the founder from Athens, Neleus, and a description of the location. So this is quite a well-known cult, even before, according to literary sources. In addition to that, I just want to emphasize the importance of the Aphrodite cult at Miletus even further. These are 2 passages from Chariton of Aphrodisias's Cararoe. This is a novel about the presumed death of an aristocratic woman from Syracuse in Sicily, who was captured by pirates and brought to Miletus to sell. So they're planning, they've want to sell her at Miletus for some money. And so this occurs shortly after she is married to a local aristocratic man, Chaereas. And so their union results in a child. And so it's for this reason that this text is used as evidence for having a slave market at Miletus, which is one of the reasons why I think it's also a good case study. So in the first one, this is Callirrhoe at the temple of Aphrodite, this very one. And she prays for the following, right? She prays for her son and husband, her son who's born from her first husband, whom she believes is dead. And then she enumerates her woes and asks for deliverance from Aphrodite, including death, kidnapping, exile, slavery, and a second marriage. So it illustrates the breadth of the roles of Aphrodite and what they and their relationship towards women. And Aphrodite is even more important too when we look at the second passage, which occurs somewhat later, in which Callirrhoe wants to build a tomb for her first husband, Chaereas, next to Aphrodite's shrine. But Dionysius, her second husband, forbids her. And so we can see that even here, right, she wants to commemorate her deceased family member, her husband in this case, along a sea route, the sea route to build up the land and building up the land and seascape of navigation. So we can see, right, the way that women contributed to landscapes or maritime landscapes and the buildup of them. So imposing and conspicuous memorial that from afar, it may be visible to men on waters. In addition, what's really cool is some of the finds from the temple include these reliefs. And so only women is associated with these ear reliefs, which have these 3-line formulas. So in this case, we have Iskra, a woman, to Aphrodite praying, right? So that's what this inscription says right here. You can see it here, including the ear. So 42 of these were also found in the same area as the temple of Aphrodite. So right, it's not just this one. There's several of them. And ear reliefs are actually thought to symbolize the mother of gods in her rock cave. And so we have this ongoing kind of relationship in terms of seafaring cult and religion between women and mother goddess, or between mother goddesses and seafaring, and then also the specific relationship that women also have with them, as with Aphrodite as well. So moving back to my final leg of the trip here, the final leg is from Halasrna into Milesian territory via the islands along the roughed coast. On the island route, Kalymnos' rocky topography of crisscrossing mountain ranges extending to the northwest provided protection from the north and northeastern winds through several suitable harbors and anchorages along its shores. Due to prolonged unrest in this area at the end of the 4th century BCE, strategic points on the island were given towers and fortresses, including those seen on screen. They focus, as you can see, on the east side of the island and the north-south sea route, and coincide with the coalescence of the cities of Kos, Rhodes, and Knidos, and their gravitation towards the sea line in the late classical period. The defensive system is comprised of both internal and external components. And so you can see each of these. So the internal systems demonstrate that they encompass almost the entirety of the Vathi plain. So that's right here. And then in contrast, the towers and forts on the central and right column here are surveil the surrounding sea. So they seem to be interconnected specifically in this way in order to facilitate communication networks around the island. So intervisibility analysis, you can see the results on the table because it's hard to see in the screen, emphasize the interconnectivity between the internal and external systems. Phylaki is visible from Castellus and Castrati, which are also intervisible from one another. Castri, on the northern tip of the island, and Sikia on the west, and the Straits of Telendos have panoptic views. So, and you can see here also the view from, oh, pardon me. The view shed from Sikia here, possibly the principal settlements on the island, just how expansive it is towards the west. So after passing this robust defensive system on the island of Kalymnos, the vessel can either follow the islands, hopping from one island fort to another, or follow the coastal route via the fort on Pharmacusa, Cape Poseidon, and onto Miletus and the Hybandus. So for the mercenaries and their families voyaging from Crete, the options create convenient connections with the forts assigned to the men on the islands in mainland, the city of Miletus, and their new home in the Hybandus. So to bring everything to a close here quickly, despite the fragmentary nature of the Milesian citizenship decrees, the variation in the demographic data they highlight the differential dietary and spatial requirements among people traveling on the sea. Such nuanced analyses provide a more detailed understanding of the needs and challenges faced by specific population groups that are obscured when using data based on the average, typically male body. A one-size-fits-all approach to the reconstruction of maritime voyages does not recognize the unique logistical needs of women who are essential to the continuation of the household as men travel long distances in search of income and economic gain. When possible, studies should also consider other traditionally marginalized groups. The mass migrations from Crete to Miletus illustrate the scope of activities women engaged in within the home and aboard ships to ensure the successful transfer of the family unit to a foreign state. Women contributed not only domestic labor, such as food preparation and childcare, but also their bodies through pregnancy and breastfeeding. No doubt they also gave birth on ships as well. These epigraphic records demonstrate the feasibility, as well as my reconstruction, of studying women within sectors outside the home, populating public spaces like the sea with women. Thank you very much.
There we go.
And I see that I ran a little long. I apologize for that.
That's quite all right. Don't worry about that at all. It's really, really nice to finally hear your results from this work. I know you've been focusing on this topic for a year or 2 years at this point, so it's great to see these results. And I have loads and loads of questions, but I'm going to do my best not to abuse my position moderating this event. And I'm just going to start off with one. For other people that have questions, please feel free to type them in the chat, and that way we can make sure we're addressing them as they arrive. So I guess, Lana, my question for you is, at the beginning of your presentation, you make these very strong analogies between what women in present forced migratory environments are experiencing, and you're in a, how can I say, in a way that I strongly agree with, you're applying these ideas to the past as well. And so what I'm curious about is that many of the groups you are focusing on in the present day, they're marginalized because they're women, but they're even marginalized groups within that community as well. And so I'm simply curious if within your research, you can make distinctions like that in antiquity as well.
In terms of being marginalized within their communities? I mean, yeah, certainly. And I think a good example is these two case studies, right? They're being settled in the Hybandus, right? They're not actually being resettled in Miletus itself. They're in a marginal area, and Hybandus is one of the areas where these hired mercenaries are being placed in order to man forth. But I think it's notable that the women, children, and elderly extended family members are being located away from Miletus. And what's unfortunate is that a nearby city, Maius, is actually tasked with kind of resettling or rehoming them in their new territory. But shortly thereafter, after this happens, like I think a generation later about, the Cretans are actually kicked out of this area and need to find a new one. So, we can see this more than one population movement and kind of what happens, and wondering about, what are those circumstances like? You're not in Miletus, an urban area, right? You're kind of this marginal rural area, if you will, and how that might change. I hope that answered your question. Did I?
It does, and it's really, No, that's very, very helpful. And as I said, I have like a whole page worth of questions to ask, but I know how to get in touch with you at some other time. So there is already some questions appearing within the chat. Can you see the chat or should I relay them to you?
Yeah, so does Laura asks, hi Laura, by the way, does the literary evidence mention specific sites of conflict that could shape where migrating families choose to stop each day? Um, when you say specific sites of conflict, could you just clarify that a little bit for me, Laura?
You mentioned conflicts that are shaping why mercenaries are necessary, why they're going to specific sites. I don't know a whole lot about these conflicts because it's not quite where I focus. So I don't know if these things are going on, like how involved each island is. But like, does anyone mention, there's fighting going on here, people are coming from here, and maybe that shapes where people are going to go? Because if there's one area that is being they know might just have a little bit more going on, maybe they might kind of choose to go a different way.
So I guess you kind of mean in terms of like thinking about a parallel for today is the way that often new members of communities or like in Canada, for example, new Canadians can sometimes settle together in certain areas because they culturally have similarities. Is that what you're saying? So there's other communities they know are out there and they're going there?
In a sense, but also while they're en route, maybe like if people know this area could be kind of a hotbed for things going on, maybe they're intentionally choosing, let's go here instead.
So I don't know that I've found any literary evidence that actually says that, but I would imagine that they're certainly doing this to a certain extent. Although I do think that from what I've seen reconstructing this road, in spite of the ongoing warfare, the sea routes actually seem quite mobile. I'm not saying that they're not unaffected at all, but it seems like it's relatively okay. I think what you'd have to really consider in this case would be rises in piracy and just sort of how warfare shapes piracy and economic systems, right? And so maybe you can't get resources, and we can think of like the labor shortages or products change shortages that have happened over the last few years in the world, right? And how those have been a result of lack of grain due to warfare and whatnot. And so I certainly think that there's that happening, but I have not found a specific mention. No, I hope that answers your question, Laura. You always ask her great questions that make me go,
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Oh, Matthew, you forgot to unmute.
Well, I was saying something incredibly interesting. No, there were passages from much later times when the Crusaders were attacking some of the fortresses in the Holy Land, and they've got textual passages about we're attacking the fortress, we're doing it for months, but yet they're talking about all these caravans just going right by. So it's almost as if it was kind of a spectator event, people laying siege to a city, but the life around it just simply continued.
Yeah, yeah, that's
Yeah.
great. Thank you for that mention.
I
Okay.
guess, ooh, you have another question from Iraz.
Yeah, it as how fair would it be to consider parallels between historically influential female and see yes, so Iraz, I am actually have been like I'm in the middle of this scholarship because yes, there are some very notorious female pirates throughout history is which is amazing. And one of the things that I've been looking at is trying to think about because we have literary accounts of women on these ships right from the 1300s 1400s and whatnot who are pirates to certain degrees or just passengers, is that we can sort of think about what an assemblage looks like in terms of um, maritime assemblage for a woman at sea. And those things include different objects, but I think it can kind of help inform what does an assemblage that's specifically gendered as female or women in public context, what can assemblage kind of, what are the characteristics that they might share? And this was kind of one of the first questions that I had when I was coming into this research project. And then of course I was like, this is questions way too big. I cannot answer this, but this is one of my ways of trying to kind of get back there. But I do think it's very important to look at. And one of the things I love is that many of these pirates actually act as men on the ships. And then as soon as they get off, and so they're acting socially and integrating with the men on ships, just like another man. And then when they get off the ship, they seem to kind of re-put on their gendered self in terms of womanhood. And so thinking about boats as conceptual spaces, like heterotopias, and sort of how they allow these boundaries or identity markers to fall away and become more, you're neither here nor there in kind of this other space, right? In terms of whites, other spaces. So yeah, great question, Iraz. I think there's some great parallels, but of course you have to be cognizant of differences in chronology. Thank you for the question. Of course, Iraz, please. Please speak.
My follow-up question will be like regarding items carried by these people and what is assumed to be male or female. And if my memory serves me correct, there was a recent research regarding the burials of Neolithic and Bronze Age warrior graves. And the research showed that the burials that were previously presumed to be male turned out to be female, of birth at the very least. So my follow-up question is, even though these people who were pirating or seafaring would carry traditionally male assumed items, might as well not be. Is it how fair it will be to consider it? Will it add anything to?
Yeah, I think what you're asking is a very important question, right? And ties into these biases within secondary scholarship, right? That we just assume that, weapons are gendered as male or men and female, or also that there's no intersex or gender fluidity in the ancient world. And I think it's, in terms of my whole project, the Fema Networks, it ends in an X at the end for precisely this reason. And this is also an area I need to sit down and write up and do more work on. But it's to kind of challenge this notion of what it means to be a woman. So the X at the end is kind of like Latin X, and is, I'm trying to come at this from a non-canonical, non-binary perspective in terms of, not kind of putting heteronormative patriarchal assumptions on women and what they might have. So yeah, I mean, I think it requires really a different mindset, but your point is correct, and it creates more complexities right now. If we can't gender objects, which I think we shouldn't, right? That how would we then recognize women in terms of assemblages? And I think you ask a great question, but I'm not totally sure I know the answer, but it's certainly something that I think is important and I take into my research. So thank you so much for the question. I hope that answered you.
Are there any other questions? Because I have another one. Nothing's appearing, that I'll just butt right in. I know you're focusing on people and, well, obviously women on board the ships, but I'm wondering if your research is also considering the way that people ascribe these gendered identities to ships for themselves. Some people say that a ship is a she, or there's female attributions for the sea as well. So is that coming up in your research?
I mean, in terms of synthesizing it with the other evidence in order to place women or repatriate women to the sea. Is that what you mean?
Well, I guess I'm thinking about, I think in many cases, some of sea monsters are,
Yeah.
there's seem to be like female sea monsters. Even mermaids are dangerous. And in
Yeah.
many times people talk about ships
Mm.
as a she, as opposed to
Mhm.
just an it. So I'm curious if that plays a role in your research or not, those types of issues.
I mean, certainly it does. Although, of course, like anything else, I have to read through it, right? Being cognizant of the male gaze, right? It's from
Yeah.
a male perspective. But I think that means that you're right. I mean, pretty much all sea monsters are evil women, right? Or gendered as female or women. And so, and that was kind of one of the questions also that I came at when I was coming into this project, is my own students asking me, well, what about women on ships? Like, does this mean that they would have a negative effect on ships and seafaring? Like, men are like, get out of here, you're bad luck. Or if they actually had positive connotations. And I think, right, in the literature, because we see so much male bias in it, right, they're definitely framed as being negative. But I think when we actually look at the role of, human women in society, not mythological figures, we can see that they actually have a lot of positive attributes. And there's actually a lot of women who are traveling on ships. And ironically, they say, if I'm going to be trouble, you can just throw me overboard in the middle of the sea. So, I mean, yeah, I don't know if that answered your question, but it's certainly something yes, I think about, I guess.
No, it does answer the question. And I think in relation to what you said, I think to investigate that in addition to what you're doing would be a major undertaking, because there'd just
Yeah.
be so many elements to
Well,
incorporate.
right. And I mean, that's one of the problems with this project is it's too big for me, right? And so, having people like the past social networks folks working on a part of it, especially because of their skill set, is really helpful. And so I think for me, I see this as kind of my life's work, but also work that I want to make open access. And that's one of the other things I like that the past social networks is doing, is trying to make this digital data open access. So what I'll do with my data is publish it open access so people don't have to reinvent the wheel. And so it can allow other people to study it, in addition to hopefully having my own grad students someday and undergrads who would like to take on different aspects of the project. But yeah, you're right. It's enormous. And honestly, the further I get into it, the more enormous I realize it is, because I think we all thought that there wasn't enough evidence to do very much with. But now when I'm really putting it together, and I've been working through kind of primary evidence about women, which is also a huge undertaking, there's actually quite a lot there. It's just that people have kind of missed it, I think, and looked at it from different perspectives. But yes, thank you.
You're welcome. And Laura Smith has a question, actually.
Yeah. Thank you, Laura. Again, Aphrodite is a female goddess associating with seafaring, so perhaps, yeah, exactly. Yeah, I definitely think so. I think Aphrodite is a really fluid goddess that does not get her due in mythology, right? She's not just a goddess of love, she's seafaring. And you can see in those two passages from the novel that's set at Miletus just how many different roles Aphrodite plays within society and her cult, but also how women engage, and that this is probably indicative of how women are engaging on a larger scale throughout these networks. And right, so for me, the maritime does not include just the sea, right? It includes the coast, the islands, and so extends into these land areas. And so women, even if they're not properly on a ship, if they're traversing out to these sanctuaries, temples, or burial spaces in order to maintain these connections with the past and cults and their ancestral worship, right? This is also part of seafaring, right? Because they provide an essential service to maintain these cults. Gizem says, do you think there can be a gender-based reading of the sanctuary being a space for women only, being located on the tip of the peninsula? Yeah, so this temple, you're right, it is there. And it's funny because even when I was writing my dissertation, it always just seems like that sanctuary of Demeter. I think I know the one you're talking about, right inside the walls of Miletus, right, Gizem? On like Hume Tepe?
Yeah, on the Humaytepe,
Yeah.
on the tip of the peninsula.
Yeah, often it's kind of not mentioned very much, but yes, I believe so too. I think like this generic kind of mother goddess role of Leto, Demeter, and that extends into other mythological canons like the Hittites and Phoenicians, and Isis for the Egyptians. Yes, I do think that one, and I'll have to look at that one, although it's not directly on the route, but you're right. I'll take another look at that one. That's a good question. I haven't thought about it in a little while because nobody ever seems to say much about it, right? Isn't it
Yeah,
just
and
me?
I've just recently completed my dissertation on the
Oh,
temple of Demeter, and
oh my
yeah,
God,
and I did a very
congratulations.
similar. Thank you so much. I did a very similar to the reading that you did. Like all of the things that you've said about like
Oh
age
no,
representation, they
we
all
wrote the
resonate
same
so much.
dissertation. Maybe it sounds like we were partly the same dissertation, but congratulations, Dr. Gunner. That's amazing. That's
Thank
so
you.
good. Well, I'll have to take a look at it because yours would be the most up-to-date scholarship, I imagine, synthesizing all that information. So I'll have to. What university are you at?
Middle
Were
East
you?
Technical University.
Oh, Metu. That's
Metu,
I
yes.
worked I worked with New Montuna at Dacha at Burgaz for a long time through Metu. Yeah, amazing. Thank you so much for your questions, and I'll definitely find your dissertation and connect with you.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you.
Could I ask a question?
Yes, of course.
Oh, thank you. First of all, I really want to congratulate you and to thank you very much for, in a sense, forging such an intimate link between the past and the present. And I'm thinking particularly about when we get to teach such remote periods and remote topics, and we can
Yeah.
bring it home by simply, starting as you did with the contemporary experiences of migrants. I think it's absolutely wonderful, and it really is very much, I think, the way to forge ahead.
Thank you very
This
much. I
said, you're
appreciate that.
welcome. I have a couple of questions. First of all, are you able to distinguish between migrants and migrants, what I call forced migrations for various reasons, and perhaps what we may call somewhat patronizingly more willing migrations, simply because we know that migrations the causes are extraordinarily different. And in fact, as a migrant myself, I know that I belong to a category that, in a way, is only now being examined to start with. So I'm just curious
Okay.
whether it's possible to. And second, if I were to sort of push you a little bit to the wall and ask,
Mhm.
what can you summarize, or can you summarize in one or two sentences the benefits that you culled from using all these contemporary methodologies and contemporary buzzwords from intersectionality and so forth to highlight your research within the ancient period? For example, could you say that your reconstruction of the naval routes with an emphasis on women enabled you and should enable us as historians of antiquity to understand better why that particular route was selected from point A to point B rather than other points? And that's a very small comment, when you're using someone like Chariton of Aphrodisias, and I am a bit of a literary historian as well, be a little bit careful. First of all, we have no clue when he wrote his work. Second,
That's right.
Aphrodisias is, of course, not on the coast. So that would actually raise another question. Is he relating, well, this is, of course, all fantasy, but is he relating experiences from his own experience? Or actually, there are older sources that he read, in fact, perhaps a lost account of a migrant or another story of similar to what he concocted, that would have enabled him to draw such a dramatic, powerful picture, and enables you as a sober historian archaeologist to use that particular type of source without being subjected to strange questions like my questions. so,
Well,
so
first
thank
of
you.
all, I really like all of your strange questions.
Thank you.
Haggis, am I saying your name properly? Okay.
Yes.
So first of all, thank you so much for these three very important questions. And to be honest with you, I also want to say thank you for sharing your own experience as it relates to contemporary migration in your own life. As I said, this is something that I cannot and will never understand. And these three questions plague me constantly. And I'm working through thinking about, this forced migrants and non-forced. I agree with you. I think that's problematic. Can we distinguish between forced? Yeah, I don't know. I even hate to say yes to that just because I don't like this notion of non-forced. I understand what it's meaning, but I guess
Well, the easiest way to approach it is, of course, through slavery, which is another
yes,
huge topic unto itself. And so, to what
right.
extent your migrants were actually forced in the sense that basically they were sold to slavery, and to
Yeah.
what extent, yeah.
I suppose from this perspective, for me, I'm looking at these individuals, yeah, and I am trying to categorize this myself, partly as forced migrants, if what we understand is correct. Nevertheless, right, they're leaving conflict potentially. In forced migration, I also can cover environment, right? There's a whole bunch of factors, and you know this, of course.
Exactly.
But the other thing that is problematic is not just the terminology being anachronistic, but also the fact that it does not seem that these voyages were sort of done clandestinely in the middle of the night. So that's one of the things I need to be cognizant of, is it does not appear that this was like pack everything up in the middle of the night, rush to the ships and go, that it was a planned, prepared, and this is something that scholars agree on and that I'm continuing to think about. So that's sort of an answer to the first one, in that I'm still struggling with that. In your second one, what is the benefit of these like buzzwords and contemporary? For me, at least, it allows me personally as a researcher to try to step out or at least be aware of my own biases. One of the things that I would like to do is to be able to identify not just women as a whole, right? There's like a whole bunch of other factors that contribute to their identity in terms of intersectionality. But to try to, for example, identify different ethnic groups, whether it's Phoenicians, through dedications, and to use network analysis and GIS to do that. So for me as a researcher, it allows me to do that. Second of all, I think the biggest challenge is that, or one of the biggest challenges, sorry, this is a very long conversation that I would just love to keep talking with you about too. But I'll say, like, I think as a scholar, I've gone through so much school, and after a while, you kind of, you're in that box. And so I want to get out of that box and challenge everything that I've learned. I don't want to throw it away, but I want to provide a new lens. And this is usually what I tell my students with theory and methods. It's like students are afraid of theory, but theory gives you a gateway, at least in my perspective, to be able to have a chance at identifying silent populations such as women. And of course, there's many other groups here. So I guess that's my utility, is centering them to think differently, but also because there's no accounts to try to fill this out with women, and but also to highlight the similarities, yet at the same time not gloss over the differences.
That's wonderful. That's absolutely spot on. And you could add that it helps you to look at ancient sources with new eyes.
Yeah, thank you very much.
No, thank you.
And just for the last one, Keraton of Aphrodisias, yes. I mean, right now, I think it's like what they have it in the 2nd century CE
Yeah, we don't
potentially.
know anytime. Yeah,
Yeah.
anytime
But I
between
think
the
that's
2nd
a
century
great
CE,
question.
BCE to CE. Yeah,
I know, it's a very long time. Yeah, I know. But it's such an intriguing
yeah, indeed.
text. But I agree, it's very problematic. And thank you for the words of caution. I need to keep remembering
Yeah,
that.
just put a nice little footnote
Yes,
when
thank
you
you so
use it.
much, Haggis.
That's okay.
I love this, and
Well, all the best, and you're
you
doing
too.
fantastic work. Really wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Go ahead, and best
Well,
of
thank
luck.
you. That means a
Really
lot to
are.
me.
Yeah,
Take care.
you're welcome. You too.
Thank you. Oh, Matthew, you forgot to unmute again. Sorry.
And to think I do this often. We have one last question from Sunaguven in the chat, and then we'll finish with this.
When figuring out the weight carried by vessels on the sea, how did you figure out the incidence of pregnant women? So yeah, no, this is a great question. I'm using modern data from the World Health Organization, UNICEF, but also one of the things that I'm doing is trying to be conscientious. So for example, according to scholarship, this is not a field that I'm expert on, but according to scholars, that communities like India, Pakistan, right, more closely resemble the conditions biologically of individuals in antiquity in terms of their physical selves. So I'm using figures from those communities rather than, for example, 21st century Canada or 21st century US or whatever. So so I'm using those figures. Yeah. And in terms of the incidence of pregnant women, the number of them, that's why I have such a range in terms of the tonnage, just because I have no idea for sure. All I can say is that the women who have children are listed with them could presumably have children, but it's either there's, yeah, it's a probably. Suna, I see you here. Yes, thank you. I hope that answered your question a bit.
Mute question. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
All right. Well, clearly we could continue this conversation in a variety of ways. And I mean, Lana, would it be okay with you if people contacted you afterwards with more questions?
Of course, I would love that. That would be amazing.
Certainly. So if any of you have additional questions for Lana, please feel free to contact her directly. Otherwise, once again, thank you very much for this. I really appreciate it. It's wonderful to see the results of all this work, and I'm certainly looking forward to the rest of it over the coming years. So best of luck with all of it.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you again, everyone, for the hospitality and also such a collegial group of individuals asking such amazing questions. So thank you.
All right.
Thank
Good night,
you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.